Well, I'm very, very excited with our next panel because it's not really a panel. It's going to be a nice conversation with someone that you've probably seen all late in the evening if you were in the guest reception. She's an extraordinary person. She has had an incredible track record working with some of the most, I would say, disruptive CEOs in the world, including Google and Amazon. And she now kind of uses all the experience through the years to guide people into growing and making the best company they can do. And so we're going to have a very interesting conversation with our next speaker. So please welcome, with an incredible applause, to talk about learnings from scaling Amazon and Google, all the way from the US, even though she speaks good Spanish, so you can test her afterwards. Big applause to the founder and leadership strategist of Hypergiant, Anne Hiatt. Big applause, please.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne, for joining.
Thanks, Alex. It's quite an introduction.
Muy
bien,
¿y tú?
Muy bien, sí.
There you go.
¿Hablamos ella español? ¿Castellano, valenciano?
Well, some people might not
quieres?
follow. So.
Vale, okay.
So, Anne, thank you very much for joining. It's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
And there's so many questions that we can talk about here on your experience, your work, the kind of things that you bring to the table. But maybe one that came to mind immediately is like you talk a lot about the Silicon Valley playbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes if you've traveled around and you've experienced Silicon Valley, you kind of get the grist of it and how it goes. But I would love for you to tell us a little bit more. What do you interpret as the Silicon Valley playbook? Do you see it only in the Valley? Do you see it elsewhere? What's your take on that? What is the playbook?
I mean, the playbook is an oversimplification of success models that I've seen over the 15 years that I worked in tech in Silicon Valley. So my very first job ever after undergrad was working directly for Jeff Bezos in the foundational years of the company. I'm talking before they were profitable, when it was very, very stressful board meetings, when they weren't sure if Jeff Bezos' crazy ideas were going to work out. And I worked for him for 3 years. Then I moved to California to start a PhD and got recruited out of my PhD and worked at Google for 12 years. So these are some of the patterns I've seen work not only in these companies that are now part of our daily habits, but now as I've moved to Europe, I've lived in Spain for 5 years now. I lived in Sweden for 2 years before. I lived in the UK. The playbook is what I've seen as the common denominators of success, regardless of your location, your industry, your growth stage, your personal risk tolerance. And it really comes down to those seemingly simple things that often don't get enough attention, which is maintaining very, very high standards for talent, attracting the right investors who have the same definitions of success and the same exit strategy as you, really understanding your market needs. It's in those seemingly softer skills as a leader, and the playbook also involves some of the best attributes that I've seen in leadership. And my list of common denominators of the attributes of the most successful CEOs often surprise people because it starts with humble leadership and insatiable curiosity. And when you think of Jeff Bezos, humility probably is not the first word that comes to mind.
Not really.
Normally. But what I mean by that is he has supreme confidence in his vision, always has from day one. But his approach to leadership was in a humble way where he not only tolerated but demanded dissenting opinions, required his senior executives to keep him accountable, to see around corners, poke holes in all his favorite ideas. And that is then fueled by his insatiable curiosity to explore what's next and how he can best serve his user.
He looks to me that he's a big nerd.
He is a big nerd. I mean, I worked for Jeff 1.0. Now he's like this space cowboy, like this very buff guy. That was not the Jeff I worked for. I worked for the guy tucking in his shirt into his jeans with a braided belt. Like that was 1.0 Jeff. I mean, he went to Princeton 2 years early. He's always been this wunderkind. But yeah, he's truly a nerd at heart, and in the best way. I mean that as a huge compliment. Yeah.
And how did you see that unfolding? So you saw that unfolding in a way at Amazon. Do you see other of this stuff unfolding there? And what was the difference what kind of what did it look like in Google? Because I think these things kind of look slightly different depending on the companies you're working at. Like the core idea is the same, but it takes on a different spin in each place.
Yeah, there's definitely those commonalities in the playbook that were similar to Amazon and made me very comfortable at Google. But the culture at both companies is wildly different, and I think that's directly reflective of the CEO themselves. It's always reflective of, I mean, you can put anything on your letterhead as your mission statement or your culture, but it really just comes down to how do we talk with each other, how do we reward and incentivize, what is it like on your P0 war room days when you're not going home until this is fixed. That is your culture. And I joined Google in 2006. They were not yet the #1 search engine, if we can remember such a day.
Alta Vista.
They were really, Alta Vista, Yahoo, they were much more dominant. And so back then we were really searching for what was going to differentiate us. How could we anticipate the needs of our users? We had very aggressive launch schedules. And we were just making it up as we went. There were no written operational manuals for how to get things done. We hadn't yet established that kind of launch timeline. And it was kind of the Wild West. It was very cowboy kind of entrepreneurism, but also among my favorite memories. Of the 12 years I was there, I would say the first 3 years were by far my favorite because it really stretched you every single day far, far outside your comfort zone. And I think that's another common denominator.
Because you went through their IPO. That was like...
I was just after the IPO, this close. My PhD was very expensive because I missed the IPO. So I was just the year after. Yeah.
And do you see, like, because Google is an interesting company where you see this triangle, or you saw this triangle happening, right? With Larry, with Sergey, and with Eric. How did that work, right? Because you were literally in the middle of that.
I was. My first office at Google was the length of this stage away from Larry and Sergey's office. And so we saw each other 100 times a day. Eric was in the building next door, and I worked for Eric for 9.5 of the 12 years I was at Google. Their relationship, the three of them, I have never seen a better team, a more high-functioning team, because I think each of them were very, very clear with what their individual responsibility was. They never got in each other's way, but they held each other very accountable to being their best selves every day. Larry and Sergey hired Eric as parental supervision, as they called him in their first press announcement, because they wanted to remain fully focused in the 20, 50, 100 years from now. And they wanted to bring in a professional CEO who could manage the day-to-day and help them really hone this machine that they were building. And Eric never once forgot that it was not his company. He was there to make them their most productive, impactful selves, but he was very professorial. He would sit in meetings often like this, and he would just let them debate. Larry and Sergey often had wildly different opinions and very, very strong perspectives on very technical problems we needed to solve. And he allowed that debate to go until it was no longer productive. And then he would summarize all of this banter into just a single sentence of, here's the data, here's the premises upon which we're making this decision, here's the risks we're taking, and recommended courses of actions for them to choose from. He could just take all this information and consolidate it into a way that they could quite easily make those very, very difficult decisions. And if I absorbed any skill from him that has served me well in my future, it is that. That is now, I just ask a million questions and get the brightest minds in the world to then anticipate what's coming next by just pulling that silver thread through their ideas. Yeah.
Well, I've met Eric several times, and it always struck me as someone very calm. Like, he seems like someone very in control of what's going on, just listening and kind of like then saying, okay, kids, this is where we're going to go, right?
Always. I have never seen him flustered. There was a day when he was the most angry I have ever seen because there were very stupid mistakes, which never happened at Google, where someone just flat out had completely missed something that they should have. And he was livid. And he just said to the person, this is unacceptable, in that same volume. This is unacceptable. That person almost died in their chair, because that's the most angry he's ever been. He's not that flip the table, crazy kind of,
Yeah, reminds me of someone. So I'm going to switch back to Amazon. You were there at probably one of the most instrumental moments of the company, which is when they launch, or the design, develop, and launch Amazon Web Service. So how do you live through that? Because that, a lot of people don't realize that make Amazon what it is right now. Like the biggest horsepower that Amazon has is their reliance on AWS. So how did you live through that? How did you see the leadership, like focusing, as you said, like, Jeff had this idea. How did that happen?
So it was this seemingly crazy idea that Jeff brought up in one of our board of directors meetings, and the board rightfully questioned, what does this have to do with e-commerce? This crazy idea that became AWS. They thought this is a distraction. It's very, very expensive. They didn't see how it was part of the growth strategy he was pitching. And they gave him a very short amount of time to prove that this was worth the investment. Because remember, like servers, computers were completely wildly different. We needed like airplane hangars full of servers at the time. It wasn't this plug-and-play kind of system that they later developed. So there was an engineer who was from South Africa, and he was tasked with making it wildly efficient to make it make sense cost-wise so that we could defend it to the board. And he had a family emergency and had to go home to South Africa. And this is, by complete accident, probably why AWS became what it was, because he developed it on the other side of the world, far, far from Silicon Valley, when nobody had any idea what this was coming. He came back to Seattle. We launched AWS. Andy Jassy had spent a year and a half as Jeff Bezos' shadow. That was his official title. And being the shadow meant that he spent all of his time at Jeff's side, copied on every email, in every meeting, on every flight, everything. Because that gave him, one, the full context of what was happening in the organization as a whole, and two, it taught him to be a brain double for Jeff. He liked what he liked, he hated what he hated, he would anticipate every single question, and he really learned the genius of the thought process that was Jeff Bezos. And so just as he was graduating from being shadow, which is now called technical director, he then was tasked to run this big bet, which was AWS, and then it became what it is today. But it honestly was seemingly insane to the board of directors. They did not think it was a good idea, but now, I mean, all startups are built on this platform. I mean, this is the reason why Silicon Valley exploded, was because they made it accessible to more entrepreneurs, and we got more diversity of participation, and you had lower costs to prove your idea, all thanks to AWS.
It was actually interesting that he went against the board. Like, kids, take notes here. Sometimes when you believe in your ideas, right, it's like push hard.
He did that twice in really critical moments. AWS was one, and Amazon Prime was the second that I saw. I'm sure he's done it more than that, but during my 3 years, those were the big moments. Prime, they thought it was so crazy that the board started talking about maybe it would be a good idea to bring in a professional CEO, because they weren't sure this crazy idea was going to pan out. And again, they gave him a very short leash to prove it. And we all know how that worked out.
Yeah, I think both are incredible bets, especially when you try and talk to the CFO.
Yeah.
And you look at the numbers and you're like, this really bad pan out.
It did not make sense in the numbers. But he did. He stood up there in the board of directors. If you are going to challenge your board, this is the way to do it. He's a master class in it. He went up to the conference room whiteboards and he said, I'm going to show you the math. And he took all of the knowns, all of the costs, all of the data modeling, and then he mapped out the risks of like, these are the unknowns. And he said, if I can solve for X and for Y, it will result in this incredible result.
Wow.
But what I don't think they fully appreciated was no one in the world had ever solved for X or Y. So with Prime, X was the cost of shipping, because with Prime back then, you could get free second-day shipping with Prime membership, which was only $49 at the time. And he would have to negotiate rates that no one in the history of had ever negotiated. And Y was predictive sourcing through fulfillment centers, which Jeff Wilke was then tasked with doing. So the two of them had to do something that no one had ever done before in order to get this result. But he showed them the math and he said, we're going to solve for this and you will get this. And so they gave him an opportunity to be like, okay, solve for that.
Well, I mean, if anyone can actually prove that I can solve X when he had done it for books and renegotiate the whole scheme, that was Jeff. So
yep.
That's fascinating. I mean, my gosh, there's so many stories I want to hear about. But yeah, that being said, like all leaders, they also missed opportunities, right?
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not always home run, right?
No.
Which ones were like the biggest ones that you, living through them, you kind of said like, damn, we should have seen that one coming?
So Eric Schmidt was asked this on stage towards the end of his tenure as a CEO, so I share this using his own words. But he said there were two big misses that he feels like were incredible failures on his part. He was CEO of Google for 10 years, and then executive chairman for another 10. And he said the first was not realizing that phone numbers would become that unchangeable identifier. He missed that because that was an opportunity to get authentication, which would have really changed people's behaviors online. And the second was Google took a big risk in creating something called Wave. Have you ever heard of Wave?
Let's try. Who here knows what Google Wave was?
1, 2, 3, 4,
wow.
5. Okay, this is more.
We have
this is
the
a very
oldest here.
sophisticated audience. Nobody has ever heard of Wave. So Wave was a really big bet. They built it in the Sydney office because, again, whenever you're doing something really innovative, it needs to have its own ecosystem. We could talk for a whole hour about that. How it needs to be outside of your usual culture and structure and teams and incentivized very differently and staffed very differently.
The pattern is repeating several times now.
It's true. So we did it. It was based in Sydney. Didn't work. Longer story why. But that was a big failure. But the bigger mistake than Wave, I think that's a very reasonable mistake because they ended up using all the technology in different ways. Like if you collaborate on Google Docs, that was Wave technology. A lot of things that we use today is Wave.
I remember when I was using Wave, I remember thinking, there's certain parts of this that's really cool. That's really groundbreaking. And
they kept those bits. So that wasn't really a failure in and of itself. The reason why I bring up Wave as a big mistake was they were so distracted with that they missed social media. They didn't see it coming because we were so focused on this thing that we thought was the future, and we didn't see what became, Facebook, Instagram, which was started by, at the time, a Google employee. They missed it because they were so distracted on this thing that they weren't picking up their heads and seeing what was happening around the system. So, again, having a product that doesn't work out the way you anticipate and repurposing the tech, not a failure. But missing an entire movement was the failure.
Yeah, you cannot get it right all the time, right?
Yeah, and we're not using Google Plus today, right? Because of that, because they just missed it.
I'm gonna be evil. Thankfully, we're not using Google Plus. It was painful.
I was not a fan.
In the same way, I actually, when I played with Wave, it was like, this is really cool. It's just like product-wise, they're not getting it right, but the technology is really cool.
Yeah.
Google Plus was like, wrong all over, wrong all over.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyhow, so. This happens in this kind of not vacuum, but a very specific situation. So I keep wondering, can you translate these lessons to the European culture? Mm-hmm. Is it translatable in a certain way? Because we have a different culture, people approach things slightly differently. So even though you've said, certain products got designed and built in different areas, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you see that as the expert, right? And working with leaders, can you actually transplant some of these things, or do you work on a lot of that adaptation, cultural adaptation? Do you have to do a lot of that?
I really like that question because it's a little bit of both. A lot of speakers who have been on this same stage before me have outlined some of the challenges that you have being based in Europe versus the States, which is, for example, different funding pools, different risk tolerance, different exit expectations. Those can be inhibitors. One, you have to design from day one for multiple languages, which you don't have to do in the States. There's a lot of barriers to entry that are much higher here than perhaps entrepreneurs based in Silicon Valley or New York or Texas are experiencing. With that said, I do think that this playbook is directly transferable. So for me, that's more about vision. And one of my favorite things about being an entrepreneur post-pandemic is that we're really recentric. There are a few.
That's a thing now.
There are. I do have a
entrepreneur.
favorite. Is that we're now recentered on our purpose. What is not only the passion alignment with your employees, but it's much more about the impact. How are we making the world? I know it's a cliche, but literally making the world a better place. It's really centered around impact rather than ego and billions of dollars being raised in funding. So I think it really comes down to that vision of that passion about the impact we're trying to make. Two, it's about talent. It's about being very clear on your vision for the change you're trying to make in the world, and attracting talent around you who has the same vision. Whether that's your employees, your board of advisors, your board of directors, your investors, everyone needs to be streamlined. When those things are true, you can pivot your business plan, you can pivot your, the risks you're taking. But for me, it's much more about the people than the what and the how of what you're doing in your business model. And in my experience, I think everyone who's been on this stage from VCs would agree, they're making a bet on the people much more than the product. And so that I find very directly transferable. And so the reason why I think there's advantages to the post-pandemic entrepreneurism in Europe is that we have prevented a bit of the brain drain that would have happened over the last 3 years. People are now staying here. They're building it with their teams. They're creating these companies in their own backyard, their own garages, rather than going to the States or to other industries which would have just been their automatic default mode before.
Which actually gets me thinking, you focus and giving people so much importance, which they have. How does, and you're gonna love this one, how does mental health fits into this? Should we keep on going with the stressful 24/7 kind of schedules that you see in the Valley, or the consequences are becoming very obvious. Yes, the success are obvious, but the mental health issues are also becoming very obvious. So what's your take on that?
I first want to acknowledge I've been a horrible example of this. The first 15 years of my career, I was working 18-hour days. I was never going home. I had an overnight bag under my desk because I never knew if I'd have to get on a red-eye flight to New York that day or not. That was kind of what it was like. But I think for me, it's a really complicated question, and I'm going to oversimplify an answer. People ask me all the time, how did I survive sitting next to Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt, who are relentless in their pursuit of perfection? If they will hold you to your standard of, they will hold you to the accountability of what my extreme possibility is. If I am underperforming for my abilities, I will hear about it. So people ask me, how did I not burn out in that environment? And here's my answer about mental health. I didn't burn out working 18-hour days and traveling, basically living on a plane for 2 decades, because my job gave as much to me as I gave to it. And what I wanted in exchange for my hours and hard work and blood, sweat, and tears was I wanted to learn from the greatest entrepreneurs in the world. I wanted to be challenged. I wanted to find the boundaries of my abilities and my dreams. And I wanted to work with people that I not only liked, but wanted to become like. And that's what I received in return. So while 18-hour days is not a good idea for very long, and I certainly am not doing it now, I think that's the key. For mental health, be very, very clear with yourself, and then have these conversations with your employees also of what do you want to exchange for this experience, for this stage of your career. The first 3 years at Google, I worked for Marissa Mayer before she became CEO of Yahoo.
Marissa's nice.
Marissa is a force of nature. She was employee number 20 at Google, first female engineer ever hired, and she was in charge of products, user experience. So she was in charge of just making cool stuff that brought in eyes. We didn't have to worry about how to monetize it. But we were having major launches, like every month. And she was really worried about burning out her most talented engineers. So she went to each person and asked them, what do you need so you won't feel resentful of your job? And for one of her engineers, Johanna, she had 2 kids under the age of 3. So she said, I don't mind working, being on calls with Bangalore at 3 a.m, but what I do resent is missing dinner time with my kids every day. So Marissa became the person who would pull Johanna out of meetings. And another engineer, he needed, Friday night football with his friends from Stanford. And for each person, they needed something that filled them back up outside of work, and she knew what filled them up inside of work, and she became a defender of that. So I think having a conversation with yourself and being very clear of what you want in exchange, and as leaders, having those conversations with your direct reports, you can get a lot out of each other without burning yourselves out, and ideally not working 18-hour days.
That's fascinating. I was wondering right now, were you ever aware that you were making history?
Yeah, I was.
I think that's part of the gig, right?
So I didn't fully appreciate it. When I was interviewing at 20 years old, interviewing with Jeff Bezos, it took me 9 months to get that job. But once I was finally sitting with him, I think that was the last time I didn't fully appreciate what was happening. The second he gave me the desk, I sat physically the closest to him in the entire company. It was like this far between our desks. And the second I sat down, I knew I was watching history be made. And I don't know why it didn't occur to me before, because he'd been Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1999. Seattle's a small, big city, so he was a local celebrity. But the moment I sat in that desk, I realized I am on a rocket ship. I am witnessing a moment in time that is irreplicable. The internet will never be invented again. E-commerce will never be invented again. All the problems we were trying to solve that moment would never come again. And so I tried to absorb it like a sponge. I treated my job like a PhD, and I literally gave myself homework. I would research things because I didn't want to miss this incredible opportunity. And honestly, that's what drives me now. The reason why after 12 years at Google, I left and became a consultant and moved to Europe was because I want to pay forward this elite business education that's been given to me by just osmosis, by absorbing it from the people I was around. And I want to pay that forward. I feel a huge responsibility to empower underrepresented entrepreneurs and to create more participation and more diversity in technology. It gets me more excited than anything else I can think of doing.
It's fascinating. I mean, it has to be an incredible feeling. I've heard some people in the blockchain space, for example, in the crypto space, having that same feeling. It's like we are handed a new chance of building something completely new from the ground up, and see how that works. So we still have a little bit of time. So we have time for one very quick question and one very quick answer. So who wants to ask Anne something? There we go. Do we have a mic over there? Thank you.
Right here.
An amazing history, and thank you for coming to Europe and give us back this. What do you think that is missing in Europe, like, when you see a 20-year-old here and when you see, the time frame, what do you say for, what you normally find in Europe in women or entrepreneurs starting that that you try to reinforce in your day-to-day in Europe right now?
An easy question. Yeah. One you can answer in 40 seconds that we have.
I'll answer with my first instinct, which was there's a higher risk tolerance in the States than I see in general in Europe. Yeah. And that's not only addressed to the individual. I do see some very bold, unapologetic dreamers, but even if you have that from within yourself, to find an ecosystem of like-minded teammates who have the technical skills you need, to find like-minded investors, advisors, board members who all have that same exceptional risk tolerance is more challenging here in general. With that said, there's incredible trends the other way now that we're seeing a lot more of this. You're getting bigger runways, you're getting earlier successes. And so while it's a slightly more uphill battle, I'm happy to see that turning around. So I think those are two of the biggest challenges, is the risk tolerance and then finding like-minded people who are also an anomaly in societies that have really taught you to play it a little bit more safe. But thanks. Yeah.
Okay, well, we're out of time. It's been an immense pleasure having you. You and I could keep on talking here for a long time. Very quick, which one was the best boss, Eric or Jeff?
No, impossible.
Big applause for Anne, please. Thank you very much, Anne. Big
Thanks
pleasure.
very much. Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you so much.
Thank you.